Hi, this is Brian Forbes, and this is Module 16, a case study for EDL 854 Educational Finance. Here we're going to review a quick summary of the major points for our case study before we look into what are the things that we know, what are the things we need to know, what plan of action do we plan to take, and then a reflection on why we chose those plans of actions and what that kind of means for me as a future administrator. Now, when we look at the important aspects of our case study, there's a lot of information about being in Warren from George Washington Middle School. We talked about student population at 450. There was some information about socioeconomic status and people moving out of the district as well, which all plays a role into some of the decisions that we might make here in the case study. But the important aspects that really concern us are the people involved and what is it that is purported to have happened. Number one, there's a woman by the name of Alice Bowman who has a daughter who attends George Washington Middle School, who is a student and cheerleader there, who has recently won some awards and gotten some recognition and has gotten the opportunity to participate in a parade in New York City. But Mrs. Bowman, again, being part of this lower socioeconomic status community, is not able to fund her daughter's trip. So she goes to Mr. Daniel Stevens, the principal at George Washington, and asks if he and the PTA can fund the trip for her. While she has a very well laid out financial plan and need, Mr. Stevens denies her those funds because he wants them to be used for broader purposes for the benefit of all students or most students and not just for an individual student. While this is not what Mrs. Bowman wanted to hear, the conversation does eventually end, and a few days later she volunteers to work at a basketball game where she is working the gate selling tickets to community members coming to watch the game. Now, at the game, Mr. Stevens encounters an individual that through that conversation leads them to think that, or him, Mr. Stevens, to think that there's a possibility that some funds are missing when it comes time to deposit those funds at the bank, in the bank at the end of the evening. So the particular problem that we have here has to do with the fact that Mrs. Bowman at the end of the evening has given Mr. Stevens the proceeds, the tickets, and the change box that he takes to the bank in order to deposit. Now, while he's at the bank counting the funds before he deposits them, he sees a note on the financial report from Mrs. Bowman that claims that she has discarded 10 tickets because they were torn. Now, if this was where the story ended, that may not be that big a deal because with the discarding of those 10 tickets, the proceeds do add up to the correct amount. However, Mr. Stevens thinks back to a conversation that he had earlier in that same evening with a Mr. Dumas, and Mr. Dumas seems to be a somewhat friend, or at least very cordial with Mr. Stevens, explains to him that he had gotten paid earlier that day and actually had to use a $50 bill to gain entrance to the game. Well, the 10 tickets that are missing would equal $50, which, when aligned with Mr. Dumas's story, Mr. Stevens investigates and looks and recounts the money and discovers that, in fact, no $50 bill is in the bank at all before he deposits it, which leads him to believe that there's a possibility that Mrs. Bowman has stolen the $50 and has discarded those tickets in an attempt to cover her tracks. So some of the things that we know that are important, again, we know that Mrs. Bowman does have some motivation for needing or wanting the money in order to send her daughter on that trip. We know that she did have access to those funds, that she was the ticket taker, and is the one who made the note about discarding those tickets, even though the tickets were not included in the financial report. Another thing we know is that Mr. Stevens, the principal, seems to be very well liked. He's an upstanding member of the community, and staff, parents, and students all seem to appreciate his hard work and efforts. And then we know that Mr. Dumas did, in fact, claim to have paid with the $50 bill, but we do not know for sure whether or not he did pay with that $50. And then we know that there could be a conflict of interest here, at least in my opinion, if as a principal, Mr. Stevens thought that Bowman was capable of doing this or had the motive, then he probably should have removed her from that post. Whether or not he made the original calendar to have her be a ticket taker, he was probably well within his right and ability to ask her to move to a new position. And then the last thing is that we know for sure that some basic practices in accounting were not followed as far as the transfer of funds and the counting of monies. Multiple people need to count and sign off on totals of cash received or checks. It doesn't matter, money received. And then we know that when you transfer funds from one person to another, that money should be counted again in front of both people and then signed off on both individuals to verify that the funds are the same and match up to the financial report when in the time of transfer. Some of the things we need to know if there are witnesses to the situation, witnesses to the payment of the $50 bill and the discarding of the tickets. We need to know what are the ticket procedures for the school to know if Mrs. Bowen followed the current procedures, or is she intentionally not following procedures in an attempt to cover up the theft. And then the last one is money actually missing? Because if the rules were followed the way they were supposed to, or even if by mistake they were not followed, but if everything is on the up and up, it's possible that this is just a misunderstanding. Something else we want to start doing as we create our plan of action here is, number one, we want to start interviewing people. We need to interview the volunteers, in particular the other volunteer who worked at the gate with Mrs. Bowman, to see if Mr. Dumas did pay with a $50 bill, if she witnessed it. Did he or she witness Mrs. Bowman get rid of those 10 tickets, and were those 10 tickets actually torn? Another thing we could do is interview the concession stand workers to see if that $50 bill was somehow exchanged between the gate and concession for the purposes of making change for customers. We could interview Mr. Dumas again to see if he in fact remembers for sure paying with a $50 bill. Maybe he was mistaken, or maybe he was just making a claim to a friend, Mr. Stevens. And then finally, we could interview Mrs. Bowman again and compare her story with that of the volunteers and Mr. Dumas to see what kind of other investigations might need to take place from there. We want to review our documents next. We want to compare that financial report with our current practices and ticket sales, our change box, and our proceeds. That means we want to make sure that the proceeds match up to the actual tickets, which in this case study it says that they do, but we also want to make sure that a $50 bill doesn't exist somewhere else in the change box or through the concession stand funds that are separate, which could have been somehow mixed up, since it does appear that the handling of these funds did not occur in the most proper of ways. Another thing we'd want to do is see if we could locate those ticket stubs to see if they were in fact damaged or if they were whole. And half were actually sold, but only the half that would have remained with the school anyway are the ones that were discarded, and that would help us decide whether or not funds were stolen or not. And the last thing is we'd want to review our district and school policies for what our safeguards are. What is the policy for counting and transferring funds, and who signs and who doesn't? Another thing that's important for us to do at the very end is to report our findings. Whether we find that someone did steal money, we need to report that to the district and finance office so that legal actions can be taken, and there's some steps there that would continue even past this. Or even if we find that in fact no one stole any money, at the very least we are finding that the important safeguards that should be in place to help protect us from this type of issue and misunderstanding from occurring aren't in place, and we need to make our recommendations as to what we want to change in the future so that this doesn't happen again. Now, all of our actions are really done for three reasons when we talk about benefiting students. The first thing is that, according to our case study, we see that multiple sports in the district have been cut out, and there's only a few sports left, and if they don't remain to be properly funded, then we're going to have to get rid of those too, and that's not good. So for the mental, physical health of kids, we need them to continue to have access to these programs. Number two, once the programs continue to exist, we want to make sure that the PTA, the students, the community, staff, everyone, the student body who are involved, that they have an increased self-worth. They take greater pride in the school, which creates more volunteerism, more self-worth, more student involvement. Those things all happen. And there's actually research that exists that says that students who are involved in extracurricular activities actually have higher academic achievement. So that's another important aspect of helping students. And then the third thing we want to look at here is that through these programs, with the combination of that higher academic achievement, because we have those programs, if we can get the school to achieve at a high enough level, whether it's in athletics and academics and other programs or activities, we might be able to convince people of a higher socioeconomic status to either remain in Warren before they move away, or for people from outside to move back into the district and have their kids attend George Washington Middle School. So with higher socioeconomic status, we have newer houses, newer businesses, higher taxes. Those taxes get placed back into the school system, and it just leads to greater success for all students. Now, while doing this case study, and I reflecting on my decisions and what my thought processes were, I couldn't help but think, who's really at fault? Even if Mrs. Bowman stole the money, yes, clearly she would be the guilty party, but then at the same time, was she ever properly trained? Did we vet her in a way that made sense? Usually it's staff who work for us that usually needs to be handling money, not just a volunteer. And then what were the policies from the district? Did the district have policies in place that would have made the principal aware of what these safeguards are? And we just don't know if that's true or not. So who's to say that it's not the principal or the district for not having proper accounting practices in place to ensure this didn't happen? Another thing that kind of got me was feeling sad for Mrs. Bowman, because this case study seems to be a little bit biased against her. Just because she's of a lower socioeconomic status does not necessarily mean that she is a thief, that she's going to steal money. So we want to make sure that this, is really looked at in a fair manner, and everyone is evaluated for their responsibility in this situation. And then last, what am I valuing? Above all, I'm always valuing the safety and the integrity of the school in relationship to what that means for student success. Part of the school safety, it's physical safety, but it's also the safety of our funds, our finances, to ensure that programs exist, that the school continues to run in a fashion that enhances the learning of every student in every way possible when it comes to funds. Also, through integrity, the community, we're going to have more people move away if we don't continue to have a trust and working relationship with the community. And if they think that we're allowing ourselves to have funds come up missing, or we're responsible for missing funds, that kind of relationship is going to falter. Some of the things that have to do with Category 5 in reference to Standard 8, number one, when we look at procedures and practices, how my knowledge of them, I think that by being able to look at this case study and say, this is what should have happened. We should have had multiple signatures. We should have had multiple people counting money. We should have had better training for the staff before they ever were able to be a part of the collection and transfer of money. I think that really illustrates my knowledge of this particular situation. Number two, my commitment to the trusting of stakeholders and their involvement. I think that I show that I do want volunteers. I think it's very important that the PTA is involved, that we have the Booster Club involved who volunteers to help make these things possible, especially in a school district like George Washington, or middle school here, where he doesn't have an assistant principal and he has to do a lot of the jobs on his own, and maybe staff aren't that willing either, who knows. But that it's really important that we properly train them. And it seems in this case that maybe didn't happen. I think proper training gives the volunteers more confidence, which gets more people confidence in you, which then gets more volunteers in return. Another thing to look at here is that as a school leader, organizational programs, I'm monitoring them. One of the things I talked about in my action plan was to, report my findings. Even if, everything is running smoothly, there's always ways to improve and to put in new practices or procedures to ensure that everything is working at optimum levels. Okay, it's running really low on time. So how do I as a school promote effective and efficient management? Number one, I make sure the events and posts are properly staffed. Number two, I'm going to properly train workers on how to collect and report, deposit, transfer those funds. In this case, it did not happen. And then number three, I'm always going to model those practices myself. I can't claim to be overwhelmed. I have to follow the rules as well. Number two here, how do I promote social learning? By making sure everyone is accountable for their actions. I teach kids that they're accountable for their actions. By reflecting on my own actions and my own practices at the school, I show the importance of growth. By showing patience and not jumping to conclusions from biased things, I show people